once you've gotten rid of that leading space, then you go to File and then Save As, and you save that Excel file into Tribal Data Toolbox _ version 3.0 folder. And you save it just this is what I do. It sounds like the easiest with your data. You save it just exactly as it is named, and you want to make sure that it's still saved as a comma delimited, comma separated version file. So you just save it just as it was, just having gotten rid of that leading space, and then make sure it's in the Tribal Data Toolbox folder on your C drive. You say save. And now it says, are you sure you want to save it as CSV? Do you want to keep using that format? Just say yes, and then get out of it, and it will ask you, because it really wants to save this as an Excel file, and you don't want to. So you just say don't save, because you've got the file anyway. So then you go to the C Tribal Data Toolbox folder, and you see I've got my help documents in there, and then I've got some other people's data. And the file that we just saved in there is this file here, the comma separated file. It has to be renamed new import.txt. So I'll right click, say rename, new import, and I get rid of that CSV and I say .txt. And you hit enter to make, and it says, are you sure? Yes, we want it to be .txt. So now you've got a file called new import.txt. So, and it's in the Tribal Data Toolbox version 3.0 folder. Okay, good. So now we go back into the toolbox and you say import raw data file from sampler. So just to remember where we were, that's here, continuous and meteorological monitoring. We're going to do QC data another day. Import raw data file from sampler. That's where we are. Click here. And it says, all right, make sure your file is called new import.txt and it's saved in this folder on the C drive. Click import text file and it says yes, 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 okay, good. Woo, import successful. So now you say, okay, now let's look at it. So the next, these buttons, the way we've worked them, kind of go top to bottom and left to right. So inspect the data import table. And let's look at it. Yes, this looks really good. So it looks good. It's got the data. It's got all those zeros for some interval like your original data had. You say, great. If you accidentally close the whole toolbox, that's fine. The toolbox is a database. And like other databases, and unlike Excel, if you X out of it without saving, it doesn't matter. It still saves it. So if you accidentally click the top X, that's okay. But you want to click the bottom X to close that window. It asks, do you want to save changes to the layout? Because remember, I pulled that column over. No, it won't really save anyway. So you say, all right, the next button is continue to transfer to verification table form. So you click that. And you can see I already entered your site ID here, so it automatically populates with whatever it knows. And then you click the site ID and it says, okay, well, the only sampler at that site is this one, so she must mean this one. So you make sure those are selected. And if at some point you add sites and add samplers, then you'd have to pick them there. And then you say, okay, set up transfer to data verification. You click that. So the way the toolbox goes is it goes through a pipeline where you actually do the first stage of data review as you import the data. And this is the scariest thing in Access. But because your data are so beautiful, the toolbox could figure it out. It already figured out time, and it says, okay, date time is what I think that means. Something, blah, blah, blah. Okay, I think that means concentration. This is the mapping where you map the columns in your import file to a big blank file that we have in the toolbox that's the intermediate table, the verification table, because you have to tell the database like what units this is, what pollutant it is. All it knows now is dates, times, and numbers. So you say, okay, this looks really good. So I'm going to click the save button here, although since you only have one stream of incoming data now, it'll always say this once you set it up. So click the lower X and now say, okay, now transfer. And you can see how the radio buttons, once you've done it, it's filled in with a little dot. So the next step is step F. And you see how these have step E, F, G. Well, if you click here for the help file, you say, yes, we want that to open. It opens up the SOP, and it actually takes you to that place. Here it is, step E, and then E1, step F, etc. So if you click on any screen that has click here for help file, it opens up to the particular help file that is supposed to help you at that point. Okay, so now we've set it up, so the next step is F. So click F, transfer, and it says, do you really want to do this? You're going to run an append query that's going to modify data in your table because it's going to add data from your import. Say yes. 283 rows. So that's a very important thing that I did not mention, is that you want to take notes, because sometimes your file is going to have 283 rows and stop and start at midnight. Other times your file is going to have 5,000 rows and stop and start at some random times. And it's really helpful to write that down as you go through, and then as you upload data into AQS, it's going to be useful also because it'll tell you how many rows worked and how many rows didn't. So we're going to say 283, yes, that's how many there are in my file. So I say yes, and then the next step, G, inspect it. So now let's look at what it did. And this is this big middle table where you can see there's all kinds of other columns. So this is a giant table that if you start monitoring metadata, your metadata can go in here, other pollutants. Sometimes people have units of, Julian date and all kinds of weird stuff. And so we've provided this big, giant verification table with all the possible columns that people have asked the toolbox to manage their data for. Say, okay, this looks good, concentration, date, time. Click the lower X. Now update site and sampler ID. So what we're going to do now is say this is the site ID, that's the sampler ID, yes. Click H. And it says yes, 283 rows. So now in those 283 rows it has site ID and sampler ID. So then the next step is view dates and times. Your data doesn't have this problem, but some data, and it's because of the data loggers and the way, if a data logger says that midnight is actually hour 2400 and then it starts at 1 o'clock, that toolbox, and like any database, won't really know what day that 2400 occurs in, but your data comes the easy way where it goes 0 to 23. And that's pretty obvious that 0 is midnight. So even a dummy database can figure that out. So you don't have to worry about this date and time correction. Then the next step, continue to import and qualify pollutant concentration. So when we use the word qualify, it means flag. It doesn't mean invalidate it. It just means flag it because I'm not sure. Again, you start on the left and go kind of top to bottom in these columns. So first of all, what pollutant is this? The database doesn't know. So ozone, and then what units? Because a lot of data loggers, even for ozone, come off in parts per million, but yours come off in parts per billion. And it says, it just warns you, you haven't recently used this units for site and sampler. Please verify it. Well, yeah, we haven't done anything yet, so that's fine. This is right. And now you have to click K to do it. And again, it says 283 rows now are going to have ozone and parts per billion associated with just those numbers and dates and times. So we did that, column K. Now this whole middle area is where we can flag data based upon just, really basic things. So the first thing that you want to look for are ranges. Now, what EPA has said is that the minimum detectable level for ozone is actually -4 parts per billion. So you could click here and that would open up a link, but the link is actually outdated on the EPA website. They sent out a memo saying that, okay, from now on, AQS is not going to take any data for ozone less than -4. So I'm going to change that 5 and make that a -4. Actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep it 0. And then obviously 999. But if you wanted to see if you had any spikes, you could change this to like, let's just change it to 75. And then we'll see if you have anything over 75. So what this button does is then it says, okay, is there any data that's not between 0 and 75? So click here. Oh, look, you've got some high levels. You also have a lot of zeros, and those didn't pull up, but it's because it's between 0. So you've got these high levels. Now this only shows them out of context. So what you can look at here is one thing that's really obvious and that makes total sense is aside for these ones on the 15th, they're all in the middle of the day, which is when ozone peaks because of the sunlight. So that's good, and I don't see anything suspicious. I mean, it's not like you have a value of like 2,000 or something. So I'm going to click the lower X. What I'm going to do now is I'm just going to change it to 1 through 70, display data outside of this concentration range. And now it shows you all these zeros. And, you know, sometimes you'll get a 0 mixed in with your data and it'll be real, because the idea behind all the air monitoring that we do is that the health risks, most of them, are based on 24-hour averages. So a lot of monitors, even mass monitors, will produce negative numbers for an hour or two maybe, but that's actually required because then the 24-hour average will be correct. If you lop off negative numbers arbitrarily, then you're actually biasing your data high in terms of the 24-hour average. So that's why not necessarily negative values are invalid. We can flag these values of 0, and I think we should because they're clearly, you know, just your sensor was off. So I'm going to close this lower X. Let's look at all the data that's not between 1 and 999, and that way we'll see all the zeros, and if you have any negatives, no. So I think we should flag these because it's not like they're mixed in with other data. So I'm going to click the lower X, and I'm going to say qualify these. And it says it qualifies them, meaning flags them, but it doesn't invalidate them. So this is just to help you find this later. So you say yes, and then it tells you how many rows, and this is something that you would want to take notes of in your database logbook. I'm flagging 54 because they were zeros. So that's the first thing that you always want to check. And you can do this in Excel also, and it isn't so bad when you've just got a few weeks worth of data, but it's really hard when you've got more. Is look at ranges, and you can change these. So like, you know, if you're looking at data, say you continue, your monitoring is year round, correct?
Yeah.
Okay, so like maybe in the winter you're going to want to make the range, you know, 0 to 50 or something, whatever is what you expect to see, and that way it'll pull up any data that's outside of what you expect to see. So that's the first thing everybody's got to review for data for anything is ranges. Then the next thing is wild swings from 1 hour to the next. And the value of 15, we sort of based upon the old minimum detectable level for ozone, which was 5. And we thought, well, it shouldn't swing by more than 3 times the lower limit of detection, right? Now, it doesn't mean that it's not real. In an hour, the ozone concentrations can change a lot. But let's just start broad right now. Let's look at any hour-to-hour variations more than 50 parts per billion. This will help us identify any spikes. So I'm just going to say qualify this because I can qualify to my heart's content. Now it's just flagging it. And then what it will do is it will add a new column value that says HD for high difference 50, and it'll show you those. So I'm going to click that, and it says, is there anything? Yes, so one row, probably the row that went from whatever value it was to 0, changed by more than 50. I'm going to say yes. Now let's change it to 25 and qualify data greater than this difference. And it says 7 rows where the hour-to-hour change was more than 25 parts per billion. I'm going to say yes. Now to look at that, and this is going to change in the next version, but I hope you get to know the toolbox, and then that won't be a big deal. But if at any time you want to look at what these flags are, you click here. Maybe we should make this like green or orange or something. You can inspect the data verification table, and that's the middle table that we're working in, where we're adding all these things to every record. So I'm going to click it just to show you what it did. So here's all your data in the middle table, and you could see, okay, so it was doodling along, you know, reasonable concentrations there for where you are in the bright, bright sun, and fairly near to LA, right? So here we have our first flag where it changed more than 25 parts per billion in an hour, but that's fine because it just went to 0. And then you've got all these 000 flags here that I think we could either leave as 0 values, or we probably should invalidate those rows. And then here it changed by 25, and then it changed and 50 because it went from 0 to 59. So that makes sense. But then these values here, it's not like this is a weird spike or anything. These look totally fine. You know, a little fluctuation here, but not more than 25, right? So we can be fairly confident that it's not crazily fluctuating. Here what we see is just like a 1 hour kind of spike up to 68, but that's still not that high. And then it goes back down, and that's 10 o'clock at night. That's the only weird thing about that one. But again, it's below the standard. But if you're doing all your QC checks right, you should report data, whatever it is, because there are high pollutant concentrations in Indian country for sure. So this all looks fine, so I'm going to click the lower X. Now the next step is if you had entered QC data, it would pull up here, and you would see like, oh, I failed that check. Now this is really important for people who have maybe more than one sample or more than one site. You're going to know if you failed a QC check and not like at this point remember it, and you probably would have already done something about it. So once you start entering your QC data, because it has to be hand entered, that'll pull up there, but nothing yet. And then this down here is if you had other stuff. So say you're monitoring for particulate matter and there was a controlled burn or something like that, where you have information, or an auditor came and said, you know, these whatever 3 days worth are invalid. You could invalidate the data based upon start and stop time. Like if you knew that somebody did something for a few hours, or you did preventive maintenance or something like that, you could invalidate it here. But you don't have anything like that. And then here, you follow the red arrow, and now transfer it to the data archive table, and you're given a chance to look at it, which we already did, and it looked fine. So now if I say transfer from data verification to data archive, let's see what's happened. It says, data have already been archived. You cannot archive duplicate data, which is great. So you don't ever have to worry about, if you want to import stuff, go ahead and import it. It will not let you overlap data. So that's really nice, and that's a huge advantage over Excel, where you can have, of course, thousands of rows with the exact same date time, and you wouldn't necessarily even notice it if it was way far down in your file. So we already have that data that we've been working with in the data archive. So let's look at it, and it's just the data that we were just looking at. And this is the only data that's in the toolbox now. As you add more data, it will append to the bottom of that in the archive table. Now the archive table doesn't mean that like it's done, because you haven't gone through and assigned AQS null value codes yet. Now what you have to do is clear out the pipeline for the next import. So you say clear the data verification table, because that has to be empty. So you say you're going to delete them. Yes, we already imported them. And now we also want to clear the data import table, because the data import table is the first table and it'll suck anything in, and we want to delete it so that you're ready for your next import. And then it takes you back to the main switchboard,